Hi everyone, and welcome to Podcast 36, and in today's video we'll be theorizing where Peter Parker will be working after Spider-Man No Way Home. Now there will be spoilers for the film, so if you haven't seen it yet, please watch the film first and then come back. But if you have, if there's any point you enjoyed this video, I really appreciate if you could drop a like, as that would really help out the channel. Thank you. Now as we saw at the end of No Way Home, Peter found a new crappy apartment in New York and has to pay his rent, because he told Doctor Strange to make everyone forget about Peter Parker entirely, so that the whole universe could be safe, leading to him being all alone, studying for his GED, and possibly not being able to claim Aunt May's will after she died. So Peter has to find work somehow, and in the comics he has worked at many places. And with what the MCU has introduced so far, and will possibly introduce in the future, we'll be looking at where Peter has to get paid. This video was also inspired by the poll I made on the community tab, so thank you to everyone who took part in it. Without further ado, let's get into this. One of the biggest places Tom Holland's Peter Parker could find work in the MCU, which might be a bit controversial, but still one definitely worth discussing, and that's the Daily Bugle. The Daily Bugle, of course, is one of, if not the most famous workplace for Peter Parker ever, even in the comics and in especially other adaptations, as it was his first job when he was in high school to help Aunt May pay for the bills, where he would take pictures of, well, himself as Spider-Man fighting crime and other villains, which he would sell them to J. Jonah Jameson. Even though Tom Holland's Peter Parker isn't that much into photography, as far as we know, he is into making videos, especially of himself, as we saw in the beginning of Spider-Man Homecoming, when he was recording a lot of the airport battle in Captain America Civil War. But if the MCU doesn't want Peter Parker to be a photographer for the Daily Bugle to further separate him from past incarnations so it doesn't feel redundant, they could go in the route of the Ultimate Spider-Man comic books, where Peter in that universe was a web designer for the Daily Bugle instead of a photographer, like he is in the 616 comics. There are problems with this, however, which some of you guys have rightfully pointed out, and that's the fact that J. Jonah Jameson has pretty much done some of the worst things to Peter Parker in the MCU, like of course outright exposing him thanks to Mysterio and blaming him for the destruction of Happy's apartment, and of course May's death, as we saw in that amazing shot in the rain. Now I don't think any of this is out of character for Jameson to do, obviously, because he has arguably done much worse things, even though deep down he does have a bit of a heart. But it would be a good question to ask, would Peter even work for someone who has done all of those things to him? Well, the answer would typically be a no. I can't see him working there if he doesn't get hired elsewhere and has no choice but to work for the Bugle, who are asking for clearer pictures of Spider-Man, especially in his brand new suit. So never say never. There's one comment from Mickey Mouse who said they think Peter would intern for Reed Richards, and honestly this would be pretty awesome since he was one of Reed's interns in the Spider-Man Human Torch comics. So if they decide to go into that route, I wouldn't mind that at all. And it could also mean that we'll be able to see Peter again in the Fantastic Four film, which is also being directed by John Watts. Not to mention, Spider-Man is set to be in another MCU film after No Way Home, according to Tom Rothman. Obviously it doesn't have to be Fantastic Four, and it could very well be another Avengers film way down the line, but right now anything is possible, especially if the film is going to be released around 2024 or even 2025. Personally, I can also see him interning at Horizon Labs, assuming it does exist in the MCU. Peter in the comics did actually work for Horizon, where he was also able to use the tech there to make himself different types of Spider-Man suits and gadgets. Now with Peter going back to basics in the MCU, I think it's kind of unlikely, but I can see him try and create different types of tech that will help him defeat a villain of a future film. So Horizon could still be an option, especially if they decide to make him a scientist in the future, like in some next Spider-Man. I've also seen a comment from Alpha Boy Games where Peter could even work for Oscorp, which I wouldn't mind at all, but the chances of that happening are pretty slim in my opinion. Since Raimi's Norman Osborn did say that Oscorp doesn't exist in the MCU, there is a chance that it could be under a different name or even a different location altogether outside of New York, but I don't think they're going to do Oscorp, since according to Kevin Feige, before No Way Home it didn't occur to them to use all the villains like the Green Goblin and Doc Ock, which is why they not only decided to use the same actors from all the films as the same versions of those characters, but also why they used villains we haven't seen before, like we saw with Vulture and Mysterio. So I think they're going to continue with that, but never say never, since even though Marvel has always been known to have a plan, they do sometimes change it for a better outcome. But right now I'm still going to say unlikely when it comes to Oscorp. However, one thing that would be pretty interesting if they go into that direction when Peter's an adult is having Peter becoming a teaching assistant, so that he can eventually become a teacher, assuming he completes his GED and gets into college in the next film. But with everything that happened to Peter in No Way Home, I think it might also be unlikely, but I still hope that he does become a teacher in the future, as that is my favorite professional job for Peter Parker ever. But one location I could definitely see Peter working at is of course Feast. In No Way Home it was revealed that May does in fact work there, and it would be awesome to see Peter not only honor May's wishes by continuing to be Spider-Man like she wanted, but also honor her legacy by working at the food shelter she was working at, but not only doing good as Spider-Man but also as Peter Parker. Not to mention mentioned, Mr. Negative is of course the owner of Feast, and some of you guys did say that you would love to see Martin Lee in the MCU, especially when he's never appeared in a live action film so far, because obviously he's a pretty recent character and was in Spider-Man PS4, which he was amazing in. So if they decide to make Mr. Negative the main villain in MCU Spider-Man 4, then having Peter work at Feast would be perfect, and I would honestly love that personally. So for me, if I had to choose where Peter would work in the MCU after No Way Home, I'm gonna say the Daily Bugle. I think Peter will definitely struggle to look for work since he basically has nothing right now and has to find a way to get paid, and Peter would absolutely hate working there, which honestly would be pretty entertaining to see. But I can also definitely see him working at Feast, or even intern for Reed Richards if they decide to do that. But with the Daily Bugle, it could also be where they finally introduce MCU's Eddie Brock, kind of like they did in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3 and the 90s Spider-Man animated series, either as a reporter or a photographer, which would be pretty cool and would make a lot of sense too, especially with the piece of the symbiote being left behind in the MCU now. I don't think Peter will be working at the Daily Bugle forever, of course, but until he finds a permanent job sometime after he graduates university, whether that be a scientist, a teacher, or something else. However, what about you guys? Where do you think Peter Parker will work now after Spider-Man No Way Home? Like me, do you think he will work at the Daily Bugle, or do you think he will work elsewhere? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, please like, and want more, subscribe. To begin, Protocol 36.